There are places that fade with time washed away by rivers, swallowed by forests, or shattered by war. And then there are places that don't just disappear, they're erased. Not by disaster, but by intent. Oakhaven is one of them. If you strain your eyes and look closely at a yellowing 19th century survey map stored in the archives of Essex County, Massachusetts, you'll see something strange. Just northeast of the river junction, above the crease where the parchment folds, there's a smudge barely visible, as if someone tried to scratch it out with a blunt blade. And beneath that abrasion, if the light hits just right, one faint word bleeds through an ink, aged to near invisibility. Oakhaven. It doesn't appear in any modern atlas. Search digital records, and there's no Oakhaven new mention in state histories. No census reports, no post office registration, not even a forgotten corner on Google Earth. In official records, it never existed. And yet, maps don't lie. People lived there. Children were born. Meals were served on porches now turned to soil. But now, nothing, not even whispers. What you're about to follow isn't just a historical mystery. It's a deliberate unraveling. A trail of breadcrumbs scattered through brittle newspaper archives, unclaimed gravestones, and stories too strange to be folklore. Some trails are cold. This one is silent. And in that silence, something waits. The story of Oakhaven isn't about a town lost to time. It's about a town removed from it. As we chase shadows between what can be proven and what begs to be believed, you may find yourself wondering, if Oakhaven could be erased so completely, what else have we forgotten? Or worse, what else have we been told to forget? It started where most strange discoveries do by accident. I wasn't looking for Oakhaven. In fact, I was knee-deep in research on 19th century industrial migration patterns in coastal Massachusetts when I stumbled on something that refused to be ignored. A photocopied land deed from 1887, folded inside a misfiled envelope marked simply S.A.L.E. Private. The paper was brittle, the edges browned like scorched lace, but one phrase stood out through the dust. Parcel adjoining. The third lot of Oakhaven Parish. No zip code, no coordinates. Just that name, 2 words like a whispered invitation. Oakhaven, separate, unjoined, barely there. I read it again and again, convinced I'd misread it. Still, it stuck in my mind a faint pulse in the archival. Silence. Curious. I ran a query in the State Land Registry database. No results. Cross-referenced with tax assessments from the period. Blank. Not missing, non-existent. Most places leave behind at least a residue. A church that burned down, a mill that closed, a railroad that never quite reached its destination. But this was too clean. As if the parish itself had been written in pencil, and someone came back decades later with an eraser. I was ready to move on, until I stumbled across something else. A clipped newspaper column from the Newburyport Herald, Thanksgiving Day, 1896. One paragraph, squeezed between a regional weather update and an item about a lost dog, scattered. Incidents of fire near Oakhaven reported late Wednesday evening. Local officials believe dry brush and shifting winds to have accelerated the blaze. Few details at present. That was it. No follow-up. No death toll, no relief drives, no commentary. On refugees or destroyed homes. A fire, it seemed, had overtaken part of New England and barely warranted more than 3 sentences. I searched every subsequent edition of the paper through December. Nothing. The fire was never mentioned again. As if once sparked, it had. Simply blown out both flame and memory. The coincidence was too close. Oakhaven. Again split into 2 words, like in the land deed. The spelling varied, likely a typographic decision or editorial inconsistency, but the match was unmistakable. I checked neighboring county court logs, expecting at least a line or two, perhaps a legal filing for property damage, a probate record, an insurance claim. What I found instead was the opposite, a withdrawal. A set of proceedings slated for December 2nd, 1896, all redacted, not postponed, not rescheduled, redacted, smothered under a black ink line as though someone had deemed the very suggestion of litigation too dangerous to leave behind. That was when I knew I'd crossed into something else. Some mysteries invite you politely. This one pulled. From that moment on, I couldn't stop thinking about this place. Every reference, every slantwise appearance of its name like a fragile thread dangling just beneath the surface of New England's veneer of order intensified. The need to understand how a town could ripple so quietly and still distort the memory of everything around it. In the diary of archivist Marcia L. Greer, a woman who cataloged regional religious shipments in the 1920s, I found one last peculiar trace. A brief, handwritten note in the margin beside a chalk tally labeled Trinity Oak Division, 1,895. Bibles to Oakhaven delayed again. Third time this season. I'm not sure they'd even notice anymore. A casual line, the kind historians often disregard, but I read it a dozen times. I'm not sure they'd even notice anymore. What happened to a community when those outside? It began to assume its silence was routine. I began mapping everything, pinning references on a corkboard, dates, articles, names. The appearances were inconsistent. The spelling alternated, but the stories all pointed to the same faint echo of a place that lingered just outside of official history. Not a ghost town, not a tragedy etched into stone, just missing. And here's the part that should unsettle you. One document I found, an internal memo from a 1902 postal proposal, should never have existed. It referenced a recommended route, excluding reactivation, via the Oakhaven corridor. No towns are listed in that corridor. None now. None ever. According to current maps, that route simply runs through nothing. So I'll ask you now, have you ever come across a town that shouldn't be there? A place not on any map, but whispered in family stories or rumors passed down from curious grandparents. If you have, drop its name below. We're adding them to our growing record. Not for the indexes, not for the archives, for the stories. Because sometimes what doesn't officially exist is exactly where you should be looking. He knew England of the 1890s was a land in twilight caught between the grind of industrial inevitability and the slower, sighing pace of rural tradition. Dirt roads stretched like veins through canopies of gold and dying green, where maples shed their leaves in silence, and time seemed to falter. Horse-drawn wagons groaned along gravel paths, trailing dust over wooden bridges that creaked with each passing load. Crickets hummed in the heavy dusk, frogs murmured from marshy hollows, and in the distance, always in the distance, came the rhythmic clatter of a loom, repeating the progress that had begun to weave itself into every corner of the countryside. New England was changing. The ash and steam from booming textile mills hung above once pristine rivers, casting shadows on small parishes hunkered against the hillsides. Wealth poured into cities like Lowell and Lawrence, feeding them with immigrant labor, iron, and invention. But in the outlying towns, things remained quieter, older, more suspicious. In places like Essex and Franklin counties, stories passed from porch to pew, and any stranger who arrived without a reason was watched, if not questioned outright. In this mosaic of contradiction, there was pride in tradition, but resentment toward change. You could walk 10 miles and cross a century. The people lived close to the land and closer to their God. The church steeple often stood taller than any other structure, its spire pointing not to heaven, but to expectation. Sermons still echoed with fire and brimstone from an older time, relics of a harsher Puritan past that had never quite given up its grip. Sin was not just a failing, it was a blight on the soul of a town. It had to be identified, purged, and chastened. And yet beneath the pews where congregation voices rose, another voice simmered, one of restless fear. Superstition still reigned. In the hidden corners, folk remedies were sold by candlelight. Lanterns weren't just used to light the way. They were left burning in windows to keep things out. Old women muttered about signs in the crop patterns, and children were warned not to stray too far into the woods lest something call them back different. Religion held its grip not through love, but through order. And where order slipped, fear rushed in. Class divided even the smallest of towns. The factory owners, who dined beneath oil lamps imported from New York, never mingled with the farmer whose boots cracked by the hearth each night. Libraries were rare. Bibles were not. Education, beyond the basics, was a luxury, and rumors were a currency more valuable than gold. In villages that dotted the landscape like stepping stones toward now-vanished wilderness, knowledge circulated in sealed loops. Outsiders brought questions. Outsiders stirred the dust. In this vast tension between the known and the unknown, Oakhaven, or perhaps Oakhaven, depending on whose memory you trusted, fit like a missing tooth in a crooked smile. Too small to be recorded with precision. Too removed to benefit from the rising tide of industry, but not too isolated to be noticed. There were whispers always, sometimes of strangeness, sometimes of blessings, sometimes of silence so complete it carried weight. What's critical to understand is that communities like these lived with one foot in the past and one tentatively stretched into the modern age, not always willingly. Rail lines might appear on a map, but they didn't always arrive. Telegraphs brought news, but not necessarily truth. Industrial progress disrupted the quiet rhythms of life, and for every town that embraced the change, another resisted it. Entire communities became rifts cleaved by belief, by fear, by what they welcomed or what they refused to see. And it's here, under this dusky canopy of transformation and resistance, that we must look for Oakhaven, born in the overlap between progress and paranoia, religious enough to follow rules, rural enough to rewrite them. It wasn't the kind of place that screamed as it vanished. It simply receded into the brush, and when it did, very few were inclined to search for it. Fewer still seemed to remember it had ever been there at all. Finding Oakhaven today isn't as simple as plugging coordinates into a GPS. There are no historic plaques announcing its past, no crumbling signs sunken in moss. In fact, if you drove past the area, and many do daily, you'd never know anything was once here. But if you stop, leave the asphalt behind, and trudge half a mile into the woods, something changes. The way the trees lean inward, the sudden stillness of birdsong, and then you'll find the outlines, not of a town, but of something missing from one. We arrived on a cloudy October afternoon, the kind of day where the air feels thick with unspoken things. The forest had reclaimed most of the land, swallowing what once was. But if you knew what to look for, like the collapsed line of stones half buried in the leaf litter, or the unnaturally squared impression in the soil, you saw evidence, subtle, quiet evidence that people once lived here. Not hundreds of years ago, but recently enough that their traces should have been preserved. The drone pans overhead revealed it best. Sharp, unnatural indentations moving in a grid-like pattern beneath the canopy. Rectangles marking out foundations long since rotted. Tree growth stunted in rows. A sunken patch of earth that formed a near-perfect ring, perhaps a meeting house, perhaps something else entirely. Geometry in the wilderness is rarely an accident. And then there was the well, choked with brambles, capped with rusted metal, and leaning at a precarious angle like a dying memory. Its stones were blackened at the edges, some cracked, and one bore the strange burn-like imprint of a symbol I still can't find in any colonial masonry guide. It wasn't just left behind. It was cauterized. We met with Edith Clark, a 72-year-old local folklorist who had documented residual anomalies in the area since the 1990s, not because she believed in ghosts, but because, as she said, the holes in the story were too big to ignore. She took us to a small clearing she dubiously called Little Chapel Grove. They used to say you could hear joyful voices at dusk, she told us, brushing aside brush with her cane. Not prayers, songs, not hymns, really. Something different. Loping sounds, light-footed and sprightly. But no one ever saw who was making them. It sounded like the usual rural folklore, pleasant, spooky, comfortably distant. Until she added, then one morning, all at once, they just stopped. Like someone shut a gate you didn't know was open. Clark led us to the middle of the clearing. A single pine, taller than the rest, stood alone. Beneath it, the earth yielded a semicircular foundation. The stones were clean, oddly so, with no visible moss, though moisture clung to everything else. They called it the Ghost Chapel, she said. Never found a record of any building permits. Never heard a soul admit they went to service there. But the most disturbing physical mystery wasn't the chapel or the well. It was the absence of something that should have been left alone. You see, cemeteries don't usually vanish. They're too sacred for that. Even neglected ones survive overgrown. And broken, maybe, but still rooted to the land, protected by law and by custom. So when the local township reassessed the area after a logging operation in 1972, they were baffled to find surveyor flags for disturbed soil in an area previously marked for an old burial ground. The original village maps, the scant few that survive, clearly indicated a cemetery at the northern edge, a crescent-shaped patch of land with 13 graves. But when the soil was tested, nothing was there. No headstones, no bones, not even disturbed anaerobic layers that would normally suggest past remains had decomposed. Just flat earth, sour-smelling. Only one stone was ever found about 30 yards out from the supposed boundary, propped against a tree as if someone had carried it there and left it behind. It read only, "Me born, not buried. Why move a cemetery? Why just this one part of town?" People always rationalize these things. Erosion, flood control, realignment for power lines. But no such projects were ever scheduled in the area. It looked deliberate, surgical. Someone tried to scrub this place clean. And yet, it didn't work. Because you can't truly erase a place like Oakhaven. Not while traces remain. There's an emotional weight that settles in the chest when you walk the old paths and cross what remains of its roads. Roads now little more than deer trails winding past fallen timbers and thorn shrubs. Something lingers, not malevolent. Exactly, but aware. At one edge of the clearing, near what Clark believes was once the schoolhouse, there's a stone step so perfectly intact, it's as if the wood frame building that once sat on it simply stood up and walked away. I sat there for a moment, breathing in the silence, and I swear beneath the rustle of leaves and the intermittent drone of gnats, the air shifted, as though some unseen rhythm was resuming the moment I stopped moving. The thing about Oakhaven is that it's not just absent from maps. It's absent in a way that feels impossible, too precise, too controlled. We're not talking about a ghost town here. We're not talking about ruin. We're talking removal. So I'll ask you, have you ever stood in a place that felt touched by absence? A silence too heavy to be natural? Roads that felt like they led somewhere once, but no longer remember how? Drop your stories in the comments. We're building a registry of the disappeared, not for headlines, but for those places that history quietly backs away from. Because sometimes, it's not what a town leaves behind that tells its story. It's what someone very carefully tried to erase. The story of Oakhaven's disappearance isn't written in a single headline or documented disaster. It unfolds in fragments, fractured timelines, administrative oversights, and bureaucratic oddities that, at first glance, seem like little more than human error. But when pieced together, these fragments form a silhouette, not of a natural collapse, but of a meticulous removal. What happened between 1896 and 1898 was not gradual decay. It was something else entirely. Something deliberate. The first concrete data point is the 1896 Massachusetts census. Oakhaven was listed in the 1892 state survey, small but stable, with 6 households and a recorded population of 41. Yet by 1896, it simply isn't there. Not marked as vacated, unincorporated, or absorbed, just missing. The enumerators skip the region altogether. Their original field notes show a hand-drawn circle scrawled over the zone meant for Oakhaven's entry, bordered in pencil with the strange annotation. Due to limitation omit? Omit? Why? What limitation prevents counting human lives? The following autumn, the Essex County School Board issued a notice of permanent closure for the Oakhaven Rural Edifice, District 6, claiming low enrollment and relocation of teaching staff. That's ordinary enough until you realize that no other district in Essex had a school decommissioned that season, and the relocation wasn't temporary. The teacher, a Miss Eliza Corey, vanished from school records entirely in 1897, not retired. Not transferred, vanished. More curiosities accumulate. Property records from late 1896 show a cluster of land transfers registered not by individuals, but by third-party acquisition holding corporations, shell entities used primarily for industrial absorption. In March 1897, stopgaps in the Oakhaven area were purchased en masse under something called the Landmark Integration Fund, a short-lived conglomerate known to operate briefly during early railroad expansions. But curiously, the railway that was ultimately approved, the Salem-Rowley line, was rerouted months later. The new line skirted the Oakhaven area by nearly 4 miles, avoiding the original bridge crossing that had already begun construction. The supports had been poured, the rebar shipment scheduled. Then suddenly, route modification necessitated by terrain. Terrain? Topographic records show no such obstacle, no floodplain, no rock bed, no landslide. The land remains eerily flat and stable to this day. Construction hadn't hit a natural obstacle. It hit something else, something that made the engineers fold their plans like paper dolls and walk the other way. Meanwhile, local family farms near the Oakhaven perimeter received vague but increasingly frequent visits from land surveyors, and according to one surviving letter, representatives carrying marked wax-sealed documents. In a letter dated April 17, 1897, Martha Delaney of neighboring Edge Hollow wrote to her sister in New London. They say men from Boston came with boxes larger than Bibles, sealed against sun and eye. One visited father and told him not to repeat what he'd seen or heard through the wall. Mama cried the next week. She won't walk east anymore. In December of that same year, records show 14 death certificates filed under the town registry of Oakhaven, all listed vague. Causes: exposure, wet lung, autumn fever. Not a single local physician is named as signatory, an anomaly in itself. Instead, the documents were signed by a state certifier whose office was located miles away, well outside the jurisdiction. Even stranger, none of the bodies ever reached county burial registries. No undertaker, no cemetery, no gravestone entries. That winter was not especially bitter, nor was there a regional outbreak of illness. And yet, 14 people were apparently claimed by the elements, all from the same invisible village. And then, silence. No tax records for 1898. No newspapers naming the town. Not even weather reports from the area. And in early March, a civil judge named Thaddeus Blackwell assigned to Essex County Circuit Court was quietly reassigned without cause. His docket remains curiously untouched for 3 weeks prior to his departure, with several case files labeled as pending, later destroyed in a fire at the district clerk's vault. That fire was ruled an accident. Of course it was. Shortly after, a cotton manufacturer out of Pennsylvania, Finley and Brothers Textile Co., filed for a 20-year lease on land that covered significant portions of eastern Essex. Their principal area of interest? A tract of land overlapping the presumed Oakhaven settlement. Yet between filing and final approval, the company abruptly withdrew. The reason cited on internal memos: land instability. A term as imprecise a catch, all designed more to obscure. Ben explain. Subsequent geological assessments conducted in the 1970s found no such instability, no sinkholes, no underground fault lines, no environmental red flags. But perhaps the final and most chilling breadcrumb surfaced in a declassified government document from 1934, uncovered under the Federal Archival Disclosure Act. It was a typewritten transmission stamped, retained for dismissal, and labeled from the then-defunct Office of Rural Cartographic Oversight. It read, Proprietary Directive, ensure all federal topological resources adhered to the 1899 Omission Protocol regarding the Oakhaven coordinates. Area to remain unlisted. Reaffirm status as non-occupable. Strategic obfuscation to continue. Strategic obfuscation. They didn't just want to forget Oakhaven. They wanted everyone to. They didn't erase a town the way one erases an abandoned mining camp or floodplain. This wasn't abandonment. It was erasure, systematic, orchestrated, tidy. And yet, like all redacted truths, something leaks through the ink. Why was Oakhaven targeted? Why were the graves moved? Why seal its memory in secrets and silence? Of course, one could string this into conspiracy whispers of contagion, cultic movements, occult farming communities gone awry. But each piece of evidence doesn't scream in the way lies do. Instead, they hum, with quiet conviction, with purpose. You tell me, how does a small congregation town dematerialize between 2 winters? Its traces picked clean by hands we're not meant to see? Do towns simply vanish? Or are some made to disappear? Because the final thing I found, the very last document in this phase of the search, didn't show me where Oakhaven went. It showed me the effort poured into making sure I wouldn't find. Out, a redacted page from the Geological Survey, reissue of 1901. Its most crucial feature wasn't a contour or elevation mark. It was an empty square. One unlabeled tract, blank, where a town should be. By this point in the story, we have pieces, but not the picture. Oakhaven as a place lingers like breath on a mirror, there and not. Confirmed with documents, denied by maps. Occupied by the dead, scrubbed by the living. The facts form a skeleton, but the soul of the truth requires speculation. And speculation, in dark history, is often where the roots sink deepest. Let's begin with the most plausible, the one that would fit comfortably within the forgiving arms of bureaucratic logic, a localized environmental catastrophe. Massachusetts isn't known for sinkholes, certainly not ones on the scale to swallow an entire town, but contamination? That's possible. Early wells were hand-dug and shallow. Water traveled easily along soil lines, and infrastructural oversight was minimal. If a toxic contaminant, say, arsenic runoff from nearby tanneries or industrial solvents from textile dye works leached into Oakhaven's water supply, it could explain the vague death reports from winter 1897. Fever, exposure, wet lung, all symptoms that could mask waterborne illness, even poisoning. But that explanation falters under scrutiny. No neighboring towns reported similar cases, even those downstream. And even if the ground was tainted, why not cordon off the area, clean it up, and move on? Why erase the town entirely? Then there's theory 2, religious extremism. In old New England, religion was never far from fear, and cultic splinter communities weren't unheard of. Deviant. Congregation sects that bent traditional scripture into something less palatable often formed in isolation. The early signs might have gone unnoticed. Changes in service hours, odd sermons, improvised hymns that mixed Christian reverence with something older, pagan even. If Oakhaven was one such place, it might explain why official documents are so careful not to name any church or chapel specifically. Remember Little Chapel Grove? The recently cleaned stone foundation with no moss? No records support there being a church constructed, and yet the shape, the acoustics of the clearing, the location all fit the profile of an unregistered worship site. One theory suggests that a charismatic preacher arrived in the mid-1890s, a self-styled prophet known only as Elias or Brother Eli, man who fled formal ordainment after being excommunicated from a central Massachusetts seminary. He was rumored to have founded a new covenant of the binding tree and gathered followers across rural counties. His teachings blended scripture with naturalism, warning of encroaching moral rot and the great unweaving of righteous society. There's no definitive record connecting him to Oakhaven, but letters surface. Here and there vague references in journals and pamphlets about Brother L's northern retreat. Could the town have fallen under his rule? Could it have dissolved in mass disillusionment, or something darker? Perhaps the town witnessed something, or participated in something. That made its survival unacceptable to the authorities tasked with preserving moral order. But again, no indictments, no trials, no mass arrests. If a heretic's cult had been purged, why the silence? It brings us to the next possibility: federal intervention. Quarantine, a word that carried unspeakable weight at the end of the 19th century. The 1890s saw several national scares resurge in smallpox, Asiatic cholera arriving aboard immigrant vessels, and the ever-present fear of something new erupting from the heartland. In such a climate, rapid onset illness, particularly if it shaped itself in a form not yet known, would have provoked swift and quiet containment, especially if the illness carried symptoms that disturbed more than the body. Here's where the theories begin to slant. Oakhaven may not have suffered a normal plague. What if the condition mentioned in that affidavit wasn't purely medical? The document housed in a private archive and missing its signature and final 2 pages reads like the shredded tale of a confession, unearthed during a failed municipal expansion hearing in 1953. The affidavit wasn't even supposed to be in the file. It was tucked inside a legal defense brief, water-damaged and crumbling. The legible portion reads, "In compliance with the order of evacuation authorized by circuit directive and subsequently affirmed by Public Health Oversight Committee. Engagement completed without incident. 9 residents unresponsive to removal orders. 3 detained for processing. Order fulfilled to prevent further spread of the condition." The language is cold, official, but deliberate. Detained for processing? Order fulfilled? It's military phrasing in a civil context, and worse, it vanishes after that point. What remains unclear is the nature of this condition. Was it a contagion? A mass hallucinatory episode? A mutating fever? Something that disturbed the faculties of identity, or memory, or recognition? There's a single marginal scribble in black ink, possibly added later next to the typewritten line, confirmed non-repeat in survivors. That phrasing surfaces nowhere else in 19th century epidemiological literature. Non-repeat, not immunity. Non-repeat. Imagine, for a moment, that the condition wasn't simply a disease in the traditional sense, but a psychological or behavioral anomaly. A kind of mass forgetting or remembering or shared fixation that became dangerous? What if Oakhaven had contracted not a virus, but a persistent idea? One that spread like smoke, impossible to detect until it altered what people believed about the world and about themselves? There are those who have proposed far more fringe theories, that it was an occult experiment, a social control endeavor, that the town was a site of psychic resonance, hijacked by early psychological operators whose methods bordered on the supernatural. These ideas morph easily into conspiracy and creepypasta, but they linger for a reason. Because regardless of which theory you believe, or perhaps because none of them quite fit something made those in power erase Oakhaven, not just move its people, not just dismantle its buildings, but scrub it from maps, seal its documents, and silence its mention. When places fall, they create waves newsprint, gossip, song. But Oakhaven sank without a ripple. Still, each of these theories echoes against specific traces. The blank census, the retracted railway, the missing cemetery, the strange absence of clergy, all lead us into the same blind spot. Not where the truth is, but where the truth was made to vanish. So I ask you, what do you think the condition was? Was it disease, as officials might have claimed in whispers behind closed doors? Or something less explainable, something unspeakable, that required not containment, but forgetting? Comment below if you've seen anything like this before. Stories, legends, even dreams. We want to know where the redactions begin in your world, because as you'll soon see, Oakhaven isn't the only place where people were told they never lived. Among all the fragments, files, faint mentions, and conspiratorial murmurs, there is one piece that pierces through the rest, not because it explains, but because it feels. Unearthed from a folded bundle of papers in a private estate house outside Ipswich, preserved only because it had been tucked into a family Bible, long since sold for appraisal. The letter is written on cream-colored stationery, weather-stained and soft with age, yet miraculously legible. Its dateline is written in the upper corner in a child's unsteady scrawl. Oakhavenville, November 11th, 1898. The hand is uncertain. The pen dipped too often, leaving blots around the letters like shadows of what could not be fully said. Dear Cousin Elsie, I am not coming for Christmas now. Mama says it is better we stay in our own home this year, and that I should not ask again. I miss you very much. I remember the ginger coins from last year, and the pine tree so tall it reached the ceiling. I hope yours is just as lovely this time. The snow came early. Me and Everett watched it fall on the black ivy, and it made hush sounds like breathing. Our roof keeps warm now Papa fixed the fire hall draft, but Mother says we mustn't go into the woods anymore. The trees are crying again. Everett says he doesn't hear it, but I do. Late at night, when the wind stops, you can listen very close, and it sounds like the old piano in the parlor, only slower, scratched like long fingers on firewood. Last week, Baby Rose kept looking out the window and talking to somebody. She won't tell us who. Mother turned the chair around and said no more. The preacher hasn't been back since the Sunday after the flower cross wilted. I think he got sick or maybe taken. Some of the older ones say he went into the grove and didn't come out. I don't think we're having Holy Day sermon this year either. Papa sharpened the spades, even though there is no planting to do. I asked him why, and he looked at me like I was not me. I do not like that look. They say it's just another cough going round, but even the birds have gone away. Everett hasn't spoken since Tuesday. When I asked what's wrong, he just put his ear to the ground, like he was waiting to hear something rise up. I heard Mother talking behind the locked door again. Not to Papa. He was already sleeping. I don't think we're supposed to write, so please don't show anyone my letter. Tell them I tried being good. There's no closing, no signature. Just space, a haunting pause, and ink, where something more was meant to be, but wasn't. Written, or couldn't be. We don't know who this child was. The estate it was found in had no surviving family records linking them to Oakhaven. No photograph, no birth certificate, no matching surname. Just this letter, folded into silence and hidden in a book no one had dared open in generations. For some, it may read like nothing more than the imaginative pain of a frightened child in a hard winter. But for those who've studied this case, this letter is a heartbeat evidence of something deeply human slipping through the cracks of the official version. What lingers most isn't the specific fears or the suggestive language, but the way. Resignation bleeds into the phrasing. I don't think we're supposed to write. The way the child writes, "Papa looked at me like I was not me." It's not hysteria. It's not fantasy. It's acceptance of something that should never be accepted. This wasn't a letter meant to be found. It wasn't composed for clarity or confession. It was a tentative tether thrown from a ship that already knew it was sinking. And in reading it, however many years later, we don't only become witnesses. We become caretakers of a forgotten voice, exhumed from the earth with trembling hands. Can you imagine reading something like this and learning it was from your family? Would you want the world to know? Would you preserve it as evidence? Or burn it to protect the dead? Let me ask you, if this were your ancestors' final message, would you want it remembered or forgotten? Because sometimes, perhaps, there's tenderness in erasure. And yet, the story of Oakhaven won't let itself be unlived, not entirely. Letters survive for a reason. Words endure when they're thin. Earth fails. And this child, whoever they were, speaks louder now across centuries of silence than they ever could have then. There are moments in history when the ground beneath the story shifts quietly but irreversibly. And most of the time, those moments are never meant to be found. They exist on the periphery of officialdom, in the margins left unindexed, in archives where cardboard boxes sit unmarked by anything except time. The document now known among a handful of researchers as the Oakhaven Directive should not exist. It was catalogued incorrectly, misfiled under a batch of forestry grants, and inadvertently released in response to a Freedom of Information Act request related, ironically, to rural land conservation. The pages are stamped November 4th, 1899. Top left corner, Office of Survey Oversight, Division 3. The opening is oddly banal. Its first paragraph refers to discrepancies in cartographic records, noting unverified township indicators appearing on 1891 to 1895 field maps, and the necessary redaction and standardization of federal surveying prints for Massachusetts coastal interior. It discusses public confidence in geolocational stability, whatever that means, and stresses the need for cohesive interpretation across departments. Bureaucracy at its most opaque. But the third paragraph cuts clean through the fog. As of September this year, we consider the successful suppression of the Oakhaven incident a completed objective, pending future weather and soil conditions. The area remains unsuitable for further attention and has been correctly omitted from all currently published federal maps, with reassignment of surrounding acreage to adjoining territories executed under Directive 17A without public census. Distortion. Let's pause there. Suppression. Incident. Correctly omitted. These are not phrases you find in topographical memos unless something else is being said. These don't describe landscape. They describe memory, bureaucratic anesthesia, a rewriting of what people are allowed to know, and more insidiously, what they are allowed to remember. If we are to take this document seriously, and there's every reason to, it confirms one thing beyond speculation. Oakhaven was not simply forgotten. It was redacted. A town removed like a sentence scratched from a confession. Not because it failed, not because it died, but because something within it or perhaps around it, was deemed unacceptable to the stability of the world it sat in. The memo continues. We remain confident that data loss regarding citizen enumeration and ministerial registries will not raise concern. The local population had fallen below redress thresholds, and printed materials circulating in the region have been collected, disposed, or reassigned for recycling. Remaining structures were taken down expediently. The site's prevailing condition log, and collapse contributes favorably to avoidance. There's a phrase tucked into that line that turns the stomach. Disposed or reassigned for recycling. These aren't materials. These are lives, words, paper trails, entire histories. Recycled as if the past can be pulped and repurposed when inconvenient. The list of those allegedly responsible is perhaps purposefully vague. No names, just departmental references, and the final 2 pages of the memo are gone. Whether removed deliberately or lost through time remains unknown. What we have ends mid-sentence. In the unlikely event of independent rediscovery, field messaging should emphasize environmental unviability, lack of cultural significance, and absence of municipal precedent. Priority remains. The next line does not exist. But the subtext couldn't be clearer. If someone were to find Oakhaven, if someone stumbled upon its remnants, its records, its foundations, the directive was to convince them that nothing was there. That even if someone once lived there, it wasn't important, wasn't remembered, wasn't theirs to recover. This wasn't simple censorship. This was a strategy, a philosophy, a quiet violence against the concept of collective truth. Because think about what this means. That erasure isn't always the result of chaos or disaster or neglect. Sometimes it's chosen, rationalized, justified. The voice of a place can be declared harmful, contradictory, undesirable, unsafe, and anything unsafe can be corrected. This is the essence of thematic horror, the understanding that history isn't immutable. It is made and remade by the hands with access to the ink. One forgotten town may seem like a footnote in the panorama of American settlement. But it isn't. It's a case study in silence. The Oakhaven Directive didn't just black out a village. It codified a worldview in which place, history, and identity are conditional, where memory can be curated, where towns can be unsaid. One moment you're a community, and the next, a void, no warning, no closure, just a vacuum into which you once were. And the language of the directive, its tone, its precision, reveals a truth more sinister than open admission. It lacked panic. There's no urgency in its phrasing. Just resolve, calm tiding, like sweeping bone dust under a carpet and straightening the fringe afterward. We have no knowledge of what ultimately triggered the directive. Was it political? Pressure? Scientific alarm? The discovery of something in Oakhaven that could undo something larger? Perhaps it doesn't matter. Perhaps what matters is that it was possible in the first place. That a community could be quietly buried, unmarked, beneath rationale and red tape. And that the system, having done so, felt confident enough to call it a success. Today, the land where Oakhaven once stood is listed as protected wetland and ecological dead zone repurposed for migratory bird habitats and occasional forestry studies. The terrain, apparently, no longer has memory either. But documents like this one resist forgetting. Even in partial form, even with their final words lost, they leave behind the chill of knowing. Does truth always serve justice? Or does it serve order? When the two cannot coexist, which one do institutions preserve? Because Oakhaven's story, what little of it remains, points to a terrifying answer. One inscribed in the absence on every map, in the silence between dates, in that broken sentence. Priority remains what? Remains undiscovered? Remains unspoken? Remains, period? I don't know. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe the real horror isn't in how Oakhaven disappeared, but in how easily it stayed disappeared for over a century. And maybe, just maybe, someone reading that memo had hoped these pages would never resurface. But here they are. And now that you've read them, you can't unread them. It's easy to believe that history is simply a ledger, a collection of names, dates, and events held up by facts like beams in a house. But the truth is much softer, much more fragile. History is a consensus, a decision made by those with voices, by those who write it down. And sometimes, what gets remembered isn't what happened, but what people could bear to live with. What happened in Oakhaven cannot be explained only through geography or governance. There is a psychological layer here, one far more difficult to map than rail lines or court records. It asks us to consider a possibility darker than conspiracy or disaster, that Oakhaven vanished, not just because someone wanted it gone, but because everyone agreed, on some level, that it needed to be. There are precedents for this, not in any single village, but in the way communities respond to trauma. After unspeakable things happen, people don't erect monuments. They fall silent. They whisper instead of speak, misremember so they can move on. We see it after wars, after plagues, after acts of mass violence. Memory becomes heavy, unwieldy. Stories are rewritten, minimized, softened, or left unfinished. Mass forgettings aren't unique to Oakhaven. Indigenous villages across North America were reduced to footnotes or wiped out entirely long before surveys or census rolls were taken. In Europe, entire settlements disappeared during the Black Death, not from mortality alone, but because surviving residents refused to admit they'd lived beside so much death. In Russia, towns erased themselves for fear of being associated with dissent. In the American South, communities of the enslaved vanished not just physically, but narratively, because acknowledging their stories would unravel too much power. So perhaps the question isn't what happened in Oakhaven, but rather, what did Oakhaven see? What did it experience that made silence preferable to memorial? Was it truly hysteria mass paranoia, born from isolation and religious dread? Or was it the opposite, clarity and unwanted truth stumbled upon in those dark woods or behind chapel doors? Consider the child's letter, the crying trees, the man listening to the ground. Those are not the voices of people excited by fantasy. They are witnesses. And if we believe them, even a little, we have to ask, what awakens in a place that wants to be forgotten? Because something did the forgetting. Whether it was the federal government, the surviving townspeople themselves, or something stranger still something, erased Oakhaven. And yet, it left traces behind. Every smudged map, every withdrawn lease, every misfiled memo, and every wordless stone is evidence of what could not be perfectly wiped away. Erasure fails at the seams. And so we're left with the unspoken, with the uneasy realization that some things vanish because no one wants to carry them forward. Because we, collectively, sometimes choose not to remember out of grief, out of fear, out of survival. But just because something slips from public record doesn't mean it's gone. Memory is recursive, and silence hums like a wound. So ask yourself this. Do you believe your hometown could be erased? Not by bulldozers or bombs, but by silence? A decision made, over time, to stop talking about it, to stop telling its stories. If it vanished, who would remember? What scraps would be left for someone, generations from now, to find in a forgotten drawer, between the pages of a book, or in the corner of a map smudged with time and intent? Let us know, what vanishing do you carry? What piece of forgotten history have you hung on to, even when everyone else let go? Sometimes the past doesn't die, it just hides. And sometimes it's not the ghosts that haunt us most. It's the things that no one ever dares to say.